Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, we have Deen responds, true to his word, not bothering to make any actual responses to me anymore, which deeply hurts me. But he is still talking about the Islamic dilemma. Now, he is still doing live streams about the Islamic dilemma on his channel, so good work there, Deen. But he stopped making responses to any actual arguments that I've made, explaining to him why the Islamic dilemma passes, and he's wrong. But there is good news. I just noticed he actually has made a video where he gives his view, his opinion, on what the injeel that the Quran affirms and confirms actually is, which is great. I love it. It's like a way of kind of responding, but not really responding, but I'll take it. So I thought it'd be fun just to go through his video and explain why his view does not solve the problem. In fact, it makes it worse, to put it mildly, and to see whether or not he'll actually bother responding, or if he'll just do a subtle live stream where he's only going to aim it at Muslims because, well, let's be honest here, Dean, if I was there, it wouldn't go very well. So it can't really be a video response, and it can't really be in a debate format, since we did do an impromptu debate and you spent most of it whining about the moderation.
Mini debate going on. Let's give everybody 2 minutes to give their position uninterrupted.
1 minute. 1 minute.
No, 2 minutes, because you guys
That's
have
way too long.
We're
That's
gonna
way
do
too
2
long.
minutes each, and after
Not
2
1 minute.
minutes, then you can respond. In the meantime, write down any points that you want to discuss. So Chris
1
is
minute,
gonna go.
1 minute, no.
Chris, I'm gonna give you 2 minutes,
Dean,
and then after
you're not
that,
here to
they can have
dictate,
2
bro.
minutes.
We're not doing 2 minutes.
This is
Okay.
why, see,
So-
but this is why we want
Okay,
to
starting
schedule
you're
not gonna
now.
do.
But if by some kind of miracle you actually do abide by your word and you actually do set up a debate with modern day debate about the Islamic dilemma, then I'll see you there. But I'm not holding my breath. So let's begin. Let's start watching this video and we'll see what kind of crazy stuff Dean has to say. Let's watch.
Okay, so what's the injeel? That's the question for today. This is early documentation of my personal view. So Imam al-Tufi is the student of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, and he says in his book, in dialogue with the Gospels and the Bible, he says that the Gospel, which was sent down to Isa alayhi salam, is the equivalent to the Noble Quran. Either it disappeared and was lost, vanishing like the other scriptures that were sent down to the prophets, inasmuch as these two fell into oblivion, such that not even their fame, i.e. name, was preserved. So he's giving either or here. Either that's your position, or, as is my position, the revealed original gospel actually consists of the parables and aphorisms from the words of Christ that these gospels contain, to which they have added a presentation of his biography and called the whole work a gospel. Okay. This is essentially my view, okay, which is the second one. So let's continue from here so I can clarify what that actually means.
So for everyone watching this, he actually brings up a good way of summarizing the debate about the Islamic dilemma, which is how do you perceive of the previous scriptures and what is their relation to the previous scriptures, the Torah and Injeel that is mentioned in the Quran that is supposedly confirmed by Allah in at least 18 places explicitly. Deen represents a sort of new position that is not very popular at all. In fact, many Muslims will call out Deen for holding this position, which is precisely why I think he's actually making this video. It's for his own side. It actually has nothing to do with me, I don't think. He wants to try to win over Muslims and probably Muslim apologists to using his argument and his way of thinking, which currently isn't very popular. That being that we do have the Injeel, I'll just stick with the Injeel for now, and that the Injeel is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we have it today, so that's quite a big statement, but that the actual Injeel that the Quran is referring to is just specific parts of Jesus's words. It's not just Jesus's words, because Deen knows he can't accept all of Jesus's words in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's only certain sections of Jesus's words in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which is very ad hoc, very bespoke, very cherry-picky, but this is kind of the avenue he's going down because this is actually, in his view, better than the alternative. What's the alternative? And that would be represented by people like John Fontaine, Hamza from Hamza's Den, and more in line with the traditional view of the last so many centuries, which is that the Torah and Injil have been lost in such a way that they are not reliable in any sense. You cannot identify the Injil Torah we have today, and the reason why would be things like the Torah has contradictions with the Quran. So it cannot possibly be that Torah that we have today that is the Torah mentioned in the Quran. But Deen knows that there's tons of problems with that position, which is why he's trying to avoid it and do everything he can to claw at some very interesting bespoke approach that allows him to say that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John actually are the injeel that was mentioned in the Quran in the 7th century, but it's only very small sections of it, and that's how he tries to reconcile them. Ironically, Deen is actually going back to be more in line with the earlier Muslim scholars and their view of the Injil and the Torah, which is that you just have to look at its meaning and interpret it in a way that is Islamic, and not to just wholesale disregard it as collectively lost or collectively unreliable. This view changed roughly in the 11th century by Ibn Hazm and his contemporaries, who were the tour de force pushing for the idea that actually the Torah and the Injil must be something different or must be lost.
My position does not include the biographies in the four Gospels. So, for example, Mark or Matthew or Luke or John might be discussing biographical details of Jesus going here, going there, doing stuff, but that's not his sayings. That's not wahy given to Isa alayhi salam. Okay.
Now, here's where I have a big problem with what Deen is trying to convince people of. He's saying that he's going to discard all of the biographical details or writings within Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he's going to give some reasons as to why. Now, this I think was a big mistake for Deen, and I think he's going to really suffer this the more he goes into it. He doesn't want to include biographical accounts or details or writings within Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I know the reason why. It's because that kind of detail is going to be even more problematic for him in saying that the Quran generally affirms these things in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because there's a lot of stuff here that's just not going to be compatible with Islam. The prologue of John is a classic example, but even the narratives of Jesus' ministry are going to be a problem. His death, his resurrection, his baptism, his birth, the nativity, the conception, all of these things are going to be thorns in his side. So a convenient way to simply just remove all of these is to say, well, I'm not going to include the biographical stuff, I'm just going to say it's the red letters, right? It's the things that Jesus actually said. Now, to be fair to Deen, maybe there is a Quranic reason that you can do this. Maybe the Quran gives us some clue that it rejects the biographical accounts, because that would be a goldmine, right? If Deen could back this up with some kind of evidence, that beautiful thing, evidence, we could take his claim seriously and evaluate it objectively. But the Quran actually has no problem with biographical material. In fact, the Quran uses biographical material. In fact, the Quran even uses biographical material on Isa. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah 110, we can clearly see a narrative biographical account given of Jesus's life and the things that Jesus did. And I mean, obviously this has been picked up by oral traditions of the Injil, but it's there, and the Quran has no problem quoting it. But it gets even worse. The Quran even quotes biographical material for Muhammad. We read in Surah 33:53, "O believers, do not enter the homes of the Prophet without permission, and if invited for a meal, do not come too early and linger until the meal is ready. But if you are invited, then enter on time. Once you have eaten, then go on your way and do not stay for casual talk. Such behavior is truly annoying to the Prophet, yet he's too shy to ask you to leave." That kind of sounds like biographical accounts of Muhammad that were given to Muhammad. So Muhammad actually got his own biographical details of his own life in his own revelation from Allah. Now, I don't have a problem with this because I believe God can do these kind of things. In fact, as a Muslim Deen, so do you. The Torah, or as you would concede, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, who were they given to in your belief, Deen? You would say it was given to Musa. You would say Moses actually got revelation that contained his own biographical accounts in it. You would agree with this from an Islamic position. And one final point, Deen, the Quran is full of biographical accounts that are obviously taken from other materials that the Quran obviously thinks is the Injil. When we had our debate a few days ago, I even brought this up to you. Surah Al-Miriam, ayah 7, clearly is borrowing from Luke chapter 1, as other scholars like Gabriel Said Reynolds, who you even mentioned in this video, say. Why would the Quran be comfortable in quoting the Injil and using biographical accounts if, according to you, the Quran is not affirming those biographical accounts from the Injil that it's quoting? It doesn't make sense, Deen. In fact, the evidence seems to support my view, which is the total opposite of your view, that the Quran is fine with biographical accounts and has no issue at all with any biographical accounts of Isa because it quotes them and uses them. This is just one of many examples of biographical accounts that the Quran uses that come from our Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John gospel accounts. But I can even include those that come from apocryphal sources. Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah 110, also happens to bring up Isa speaking from the cradle as an infant. This sounds suspiciously like the infancy gospel of Thomas, or, most likely, the Arabic infancy gospel equivalent, which appears later and was available in the time of Muhammad in the 7th century in Arabia. Jesus making clay birds, breathing life into them, again from the same infancy gospel of Thomas. I could go through a ton of these, but to be honest, I don't actually have the time to do it. I think after all of this, I've kind of made my point. But one final thing, just to really illustrate why I think this is kind of dumb. Look at the example Deen is using here, and I find this really interesting. He quotes Matthew 9:9.
So one example I give is Matthew 9:9. As Jesus went on there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Isa alayhi salam wasn't given the meaning of this text, which is Jesus went and did this and did that. Obviously not. Okay, not even Christians believe that.
Now, I want you to read this, but I want you to read this in a way where you ignore all of the explanation, context, or biographical material, and just read the actual words of Jesus and explain to me what is being meant here. Let's do that, right? Let's do this. As Jesus went on from there, okay, can't have that, that's biographical material. He saw a man named Matthew, again, biographical material, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me. Okay, that's in quotes, so Jesus says that, so that could be the injeel according to Deen. He told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. Well, we can't accept that because that's also biographical material. So the only thing we have here in this very short story is the words follow me, which I'm not going to lie, Deen, I don't think Allah revealed the words follow me to Isa and then never gave any context on what that was meant to be or who it was for or what it means or... I mean, did it mean follow me like accept me as a prophet? Did it mean a literal sense of follow me, like he's just telling someone to follow him, which we know is correct because that's the actual context of the verse that the injeel gives us? Did he mean follow me in some other non-literal way? And follow him to where? Is he saying just follow me, that's it? Or is he trying to say follow me to somewhere? Is he guiding him someplace? Is it part of a parable? Is it some sort of instruction about the law? Maybe it's even referring to future prophecies about Muhammad. You know, who knows? But the point is that when you remove the biographical accounts that surround a lot of Jesus' speech, it in effect means that you have no idea what on earth this even means, and it just becomes a collection of random quotes that don't mean anything to anyone without any further context. It's a good thing the Quran has no problem with using biographical material, otherwise we'd be in a real pickle, wouldn't we, Deen?
Part of my position also is that it does not include the author's notes. So whatever the author of John wants to say about in the beginning was the word is with God, and the word blah 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 blah. No, like none of that is possibly the injeel because John was not given the injeel. Isa alayhi salam was given the injeel. So whoever authored John, when he's writing this epilogue, this is not possibly the injeel. Okay, so this is the second category.
This is something that Muslim apologists are kind of hoping you ignore, and Deen is playing into this as well. He wants you to think that the Quran is dead set on this idea that whatever was given to Isa could not have either have been an actual gospel itself in some sort of written format or even an oral format. It was just given to him orally, to which then either he, because the Quran actually records that Jesus could write, at least in one interpretation, or that his faithful disciples, who again in the Islamic context are Muslim, wrote down for him. Deen and others are hoping you don't realize that these are viable interpretations of reading the Quranic context. The Quran is kind of ambiguous about exactly how this came down. Some might say it's an actual book given to Isa, others will say, well, it's just teachings that were given to Isa. But given that the Quran makes it clear that this injeel is still around in the 7th century, and as me and Deen will both agree, is Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, or at least found in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, it seems likely that the Quran accepts that the biographical accounts surrounding it are legit, and, dare I even say it, inspired from Allah. But Muslim apologists want to have this hard distinction that it makes no sense for biographical accounts to be sent down, but again, Moses or Musa was given his own biographical details according to your view, Deen, and even Muhammad was given his own biographical details in his own revelation. So that's 2 out of 3, and you're arguing that the third one, the Injil, cannot have done this for reasons. And remember, Deen is assuming that the author or authors of the Quran are just de facto right and will lean towards the more reasonable explanation. I'm just not willing to be that uncritical about it. I think one of the fair interpretations you could bring is that whoever wrote the Quran, or whoever said the Quran is probably more accurate, may have actually believed that the Injil, which they have never read, most likely, actually is a book given to Isa, which could indeed include his own biographical accounts. And you might say, no, you Christians, you don't believe that. Well, that's great, but unfortunately for you, Deen, what Christians believe is irrelevant here. This is your religion that you can't explain or make sense of. What Christians believe in our religion is a totally different thing, so stop appealing to it. Every time you pivot to Christians to either support your view or to distract from how bad your own view is, it doesn't help, Deen. It's just making you look silly.
And one example of this, actually, beyond John 1:1, is Mark 7. So you might hear Christians saying that Jesus abrogated kosher laws, right?
Deen gets very caught up with this idea that Christians aren't following the Jewish law, therefore they're bad Muslims, I guess, in his view, which is weird. I don't quite fully get this. Isa in Surah Al-Imran ayah 50 tells us that he actually did indeed change the law. Now, we don't exactly agree with that as Christians, it's not how we think of it, but the fact that your own Quran says that Isa did this kind of makes our case even better.
And they use this as evidence where they say that Jesus, when he says it's not what goes into their heart, but into their stomach and then out of the body, because he says, before that, don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? And before that, he says, it's not what comes in you that defiles you, it's what comes out of you. Now, Matthew's interpretation is Jesus declared all foods clean. But if Jesus made it clear that he made all foods clean by the statement, why is Mark adding his commentary there? Matthew doesn't add his commentary there. Matthew just leaves Jesus' statements for how it is.
And again, this is just arbitrary without evidence. You simply float the idea of, well, maybe this is just added by the author. Okay, we'll prove it was added by the author. Is it in the Greek? Yeah. Okay, so how do you know this isn't the correct interpretation of Jesus' words, especially since the context seems to assume so, especially since the author of Luke seems to have thought so in Acts when he clarifies this, when he talks about Peter getting a vision about this. Again, when we look at our scripture holistically, because we can do that as Christians, we get this doctrine, which is backed up by all of these biblical verses, but you simply take one, look at it and go, maybe this never happened. Maybe this is just an author just adding his own interpretation. How do we know? Again, it's just being nitpicky for the sake of being nitpicky and refusing to look at any other verse, but just this one in isolation.
And the last caveat for my position is the gospel sayings are not preserved in what you would say verbatim. They are preserved in meaning. Okay. So the meaning of the Gospels is what we're looking at here. We're not looking at verbatim speech of Isa alayhi salam that would have been given to him, that is wahi. Okay? Because we know, obviously, just from a quick Google search, you'll see multiple Christian scholars will tell you, just as the first link says, that most people spoke Aramaic, so most likely Jesus, peace be upon him, would have spoken Aramaic.
So Deen actually makes a pretty good point here in that he says, well, his view is that the gospel writings are not preserved verbatim in that they have preserved the very same words that Christ has spoken. Now, that may be the case in terms of language. Jesus spoke Aramaic at a minimum. Most scholars would probably say that he spoke Greek to some degree as well. Hebrew is a bit more contentious, given the fact that this area was Hellenized hundreds of years prior by Alexander the Great, given the Old Testament was translated into Greek hundreds of years prior, given that Jesus' own disciples, Andrew and Philip, have Greek origin names, given that Jesus is recording to speak to Pontius Pilate, who would have spoke most likely Greek, given that he spoke to centurions, Roman soldiers, again, who would have most likely spoke Greek, the woman at the well. The best explanation is that Jesus knew some Greek, but whether he said some parts in one language and some parts in another language is an open question. Interestingly, I'd wonder if Deen was consistent with this and would look a bit inwardly and acknowledge whether or not the Quran is also not verbatim. For example, Isa is quoted in Surah Al-Ma'idah ayat 116, but obviously this is written in Arabic, and Jesus never spoke Arabic. So that would mean that the Quran does not record Prophet's words verbatim. Right, Deen? Are you going to be honest and say that that's the case? I would love for you to do that and tell your Muslim friends that the Quran is not meant to be taken verbatim when it comes to talking about the previous prophets.
So I think this is the last one, the last explicit mentioning of what the contents of the injeel consist of. And as you can tell, every time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions explicitly what the contents of the injeel is, it's the sayings of Isa alayhi salam. It's not biographical material. It is not stuff from the Pauline epistles, and it's not other material found within the New Testament. So this one's really interesting. Now, Gabriel Said Reynolds, clown of a scholar, says that this is actually an issue. So what he says is, oh, you know, this has issues with the Torah, which my presentation isn't about today, but we do have reconciliations for that too, no problem. But the topic here is the gospel. And he says, you know, there's no verse in the gospel about killing or fighting in the cause of Allah, as you can see in the blue highlight. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allah has indeed purchased from the believers their lives and wealth in exchange for paradise. They fight in the cause of Allah and kill or are killed. This is a true promise binding on him in the Torah, Gospel, and Quran. So, you know, obviously academics, quote unquote, like Gabriel Shade Reynolds would like to say, oh, you know, they fight in the cause of Allah and kill or killed. Where do you find that? Where do you fight? Where do you find fighting in the cause of God in Jihad al-Talab, offensive jihad, in the Gospels? Where is it?
So, Deen, that's a really great point. Where is the call to go and wage some kind of jihad or offensive military battle in the name of Allah? Where is that found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Keep in mind, by the way, the Quran says that this is something binding upon them, which would mean that, up until this point at least, in the 7th century, both Christians and Jews would be required to go out and make jihad for Allah. And presumably if they fail to do this, something bad will happen to them. They'll be accountable in some sense. So that verse better be there, otherwise you have some serious issues with how you reconcile Allah's way of thinking, given that Allah is imposing moral duties on Christians and Jews without them actually having any knowledge that this is something they're supposed to do, and then punishing them for failing to do it. So let's see what Deen's response is to this.
Well, the response to that, quite simply, is that you have a separation here from the first clause from the second. So you have Allah has indeed purchased from the believers their lives and wealth in exchange for paradise. And that is the promise binding on him in the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the blue is giving an example of the companions in Medina. They fight in the cause of Allah and kill or kill. So it's an example of purchasing heaven, Jannah, through your life. So it's one example. This isn't what's the promise binding on them.
That, my days, that was the most insane interpretation of this verse. Ladies and gentlemen, I can only think that Deen hopes his viewers are just dumb as a rock to even contemplate that that's what is trying to be conveyed here in this verse. Okay, let's start off with some of the obvious glaring problems. First of all, this is in Surah 9, Surah Al-Tawbah. Surah Al-Tawbah is all about warfare. It is all, in fact, actually, a lot of Surah Al-Tawbah is Muhammad critiquing those who do not go and wage offensive jihad, the hypocrites, the ones who say they will but they don't. It talks about sharing of booty, not that booty, Deen, military loot from the enemies that they want to distribute amongst themselves. Amongst who? Soldiers, commanders, people in the military. So the context backfires immensely. But maybe the verse itself has some sort of hidden context. I mean, let's read. Allah has indeed purchased from the believers their lives. Deen, did you read the bit? Their lives? You probably should have highlighted that. Because you're trying to say that that blue bit, that middle bit, you can just disconnect and associate with some totally random other thing. Which first of all means that that verse is injected without context. It's just randomly leaving the previous context, coming up with a new one, and then returning to the first one's context again afterwards, which makes no sense from a storytelling point of view. But you've totally missed the fact that in the first clause it says purchasing their lives, Deen, which is a military understanding. How do we know it's a military understanding? Because the next verse tells us it. They fight in the cause of Allah and kill or are killed, or another variant is that they kill and are killed. And the very next bit, this is a promise. This is a true promise, binding on him in the Torah, the Gospel, and the Quran. But wait, maybe I've missed something. Maybe tafsir writers from early Islamic scholars can correct me of this error. Maybe I'm missing something here. Oh, no. It looks like Al-Jalalain, Ibn Abbas, Ibn Kathir, and others all share the same military understanding that the verse plainly indicates, it's not even indicating, plainly demands, and the context of Al-Tawbah as a wider chapter, chapter 9 of the Quran says. It's a chapter about war. Deen.
The next question would be, now that we've solved that, because obviously this would be a verse where people from the other camp would like to say, you know, there has to be an alternative Torah and Injeel because we don't find any verse in the Gospels today talking about jihad al-Talab. You don't find that. So this is a reconciliation, so you don't have to say there's some alternative gospel in Medina. I mean, you could say there's an alternative one, but not a completely different one that changes the essence of what we have in our Gospels today. At least that's my position. reconcile that, how are we going to reconcile purchasing from the believers their lives and wealth? Well, we can easily show this within the Gospels itself from the sayings of Isa alayhi salam yet again. So my first example is going to be on through sacrificing your life, you will attain Jannah, martyrdom. You have this theme in the Gospels. In Mark 10, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me in the Gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in the present age, homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and fields, along with persecutions and the age to come eternal life. So to gain eternal life comes with persecutions.
Okay, so Deen. Persecution is not a synonym for offensive military war. Persecution is suffering that you have inflicted upon you by someone else. To say that that is synonymous with military offensive jihad is really, really bad. Like that makes no sense, Deen. That is not correct at all. In fact, no one will have that interpretation of this text other than you, presumably. You can read the entirety of this chapter, Deen, or for that matter, any of the entire book or the other 3 gospel accounts, and you will not see anything that looks like Jesus is telling people to go and wage military jihad. And you know this. You even mention the other camp, that is, the other side of Muslims desperately trying to solve the Islamic dilemma, who they even use it as evidence that it cannot be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because it's not found in there. Okay, he gives other examples, so maybe it gets better.
Okay. The next one is in Matthew 5, blessed are those who persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Persecution, dying for the sake of God, you'll gain the kingdom of heaven.
Once again, it's the same problem. You think that you can't quote the Beatitudes in Matthew and think that, well, I guess persecution must mean offensive military jihad. By that logic, would Deen have to say something like, Muhammad was engaged in offensive military jihad when he was being persecuted in Mecca by the pagans? Was Muhammad on an offensive jihad, Deen, when he was in Mecca, when he had to be close to Abu Talib, his uncle, and hope that the pagans wouldn't hurt him? Was he on some sort of offensive military campaign at this point? What, him and like 7 people or something? Deen then goes on to give other examples that are related to the other part, which is that you give your wealth for the kingdom of heaven. I don't have an issue with that part. I have an issue with the offensive military jihad part. That to me is evidence that you cannot reconcile Surah 9, Ayah 111 with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because there simply isn't any parallel to be found regarding offensive military jihad.
So yeah, these are the linkages for these Quran verses. I mean, we can find intertexts for all the contents of the Injeel we find in the Quran. I think the only difficult one a lot of people would have is Quran chapter 9 verse 111, but that, as I showed, is a reconciliation we can give there.
At least Deen admits that, yes, this is problematic. And I agree, it is. It's almost as if Muhammad or whoever gave the Quran didn't quite understand what was explicitly written in the Injeel. He was just hearing things, Deen, like how the pagans at the time called Muhammad the ear, according to your Quran. It's almost as if that would be a much more easy, and even Quranic actually, explanation as to why the Quran has made these blunders. Deen then goes on in the rest of the video to give passages in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John of Jesus' parables predominantly, and then expresses the similarities between that and Hadith, which is weird because that's usually a Christian talking point about how the Hadith obviously robbed material from the Injeel, but okay. That's a weird loss there. A weird L, I think the kids call it, the kids these days. But finally, Deen, I think you're missing the bigger point as to why all of this is extremely problematic for you. First of all, everything you've done is incredibly poor, ad hoc, bespoke, without evidence, pure assumption, and if anything, to be honest with you, wishful thinking. But here's the real kicker for me. If the Injeel and the Torah were binding on Christians and Jews at the 7th century. Now, I understand you think that Muhammad then abrogates in some sense this, and that the true religion is Islam and everyone is called to follow Islam following Muhammad coming. But what about before then? You see, this leaves a very awkward period of time. Let's say, for example, the period of time between when the Injeel came and when Muhammad came. So we're talking roughly 600 years. So in this 600-year period, the Christians are accountable to the Injeel, which contains valid instructions of law, according to you, valid prophecies, according to you, valid theology, in some sense, maybe, Deen, valid history, valid parables, valid moral commandments that the Christians are expected to follow, and be able to do so, or will receive a punishment accordingly. Surah Al-Ma'idah ayah 47. So then, in what sense are they able to follow these commands if the only way they can decipher which of these commands is the actual injeel and which has been distorted, because again, you don't think all of Jesus' words in the Matthew, Mark, Luke and John accounts are correct, some of it has been corrupted. How are they able to differentiate that if the Quran is the only way of doing this? And to be honest with you, it's a terrible way of doing it anyway, and I can give reasons to show that. But if they don't even have the Quran yet, then how can they be held accountable? This to me means one of two things. Either Allah is ignorant and doesn't know that the injeel has been corrupted, and therefore Christians cannot faithfully follow it anymore, or Allah is evil because he knows this, he knows it's been corrupted in your view, he knows they don't have it, but he doesn't care because he's an evil God and he delights in punishing Christians arbitrarily and without justice or mercy. This is a big issue that you're ultimately going to have to deal with if you want to believe that there is any sense of something being binding, like it says in Surah 9, ayah 111, on the Christians up until the revelation of the Quran. I'll leave that as something for you to solve and hopefully make a video response to, Deen, because so far you've been ignoring me. You'll have to jump on Testifies Live again, and then maybe you'll join, and then maybe I can ask you then. But I think it's clear what's happening here. You've realized you can't give good responses to this, which is why you're avoiding direct talks with me, or if you do, it's on a live stream where you try and shift to other issues because the Islamic dilemma is a big L for you guys. And if it isn't, you would simply respond with refutations of what I'm saying, but you can't respond, which is why you won't respond to this video. I'm willing to bet to anyone who's watching this that Deen will not respond to this video, and I'm going to take that as a sign that he genuinely has no answers to the questions I'm asking. But let's see if he does. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, God bless you all. That includes you, Deen, and have a lovely day. God bless.